Welcome everyone. Bienvenue à tous. Benvenido a todos. Thank you for joining us from all around the world for this important discussion. And before we start, please let's give a quick practical note from our interpretation team. Next, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan. I'm here with my co-interpreters Maria and Gael and Rachel. We have a multilingual event for you today. You can listen and participate in English, Spanish, or French, and I will tell you how to select your preferred language. If you want to choose English, go to the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. Click on the three dots where it says More, and then you'll see a little menu pop up. Click on the globe icon where it says Interpretation, and then select English. If you're on a cell phone or a tablet, you'll have to select Done after you choose English. You'll hit Done to save your preferences. We'll explain these steps also in Spanish and in French. Hola, buenos días a todo el mundo. Yo soy Megan, estoy aquí con mis colegas María, Gael y Rachel y estaremos haciendo la interpretación simultánea entre inglés, francés y español. Para escuchar y participar en español, por favor, busquen el menú en la parte inferior de su pantalla de Zoom. Presionen donde dice Más, que es un círculo con 3 puntitos. Y luego presionen el icono del globito donde dice Interpretación. Ahí van a poder seleccionar el español. Y si están en un teléfono móvil o una tableta, tienen que presionar Done o Finalizado para que se guarden sus preferencias. Si alguien tiene problemas con la función de interpretación, háganoslo saber, por favor, y les ayudamos. Ahora vamos al francés, por favor. Go ahead, Rachel.
Merci Megan. Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Gaëlle, je suis ici avec ma collègue Rachel et on va s'occuper de l'interprétation en français aujourd'hui. Pour les francophones, n'hésitez pas à intervenir en français si vous le souhaitez. Et donc pour accéder à l'interprétation en français, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, vous pouvez cliquer en bas à droite de votre écran sur le globe et puis choisir le canal de français. Si vous êtes sur une tablette ou un téléphone, vous pouvez cliquer sur les 3 petits points ou bien sûr plus, puis interprétation, puis français, puis terminer. Si vous avez le moindre souci avec l'interprétation pendant la session, veuillez nous le faire savoir sur le chat et on vous aidera dès que possible. Merci beaucoup de nous aider à créer cette session multilingue. Back to you, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. So next slide, please. Yes, during this webinar, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box that you can see on the bottom of your screen. And now, next, please. So today, we are here to discuss a very, very important topic. And let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm really delighted to be your moderator today. I'm Dr. Sabine Brels, a lawyer specialized in animal protection and food systems, running the NGO called World Animal Justice, and we are a proud member of the Stop Financing Factory Farming Coalition, hosting this webinar today. We are gathered to discuss livestock lengthening shadow 20 years after the livestock long shadow. And over the next 90 minutes, we'll hear from leading experts exploring how livestock production has shaped our food systems, the challenges we now face, and the solutions needed to transform them, including the critical role that development finance can play in shortening livestock shadow. Today's discussion brings together animal welfare, public health, food security, environment, and development finance perspectives to explore one of the defining sustainability challenges of our time. The timing of this webinar couldn't be more relevant. Why? Because Many parts of Europe and beyond are currently experiencing an extreme heat wave with severe impacts on all living beings, including millions of farm animals suffering from severe heat stress. And that is a powerful reminder that animal welfare, climate change, and food systems are deeply interconnected, and that the need for action has never been so urgent. Next, please. So a warm thanks to all of you for making this event possible today, and especially to our brilliant speakers, namely Peter Stevenson, Merel van der Mark, and Lasse Bruun. Unfortunately, Francesca Gallelli from the World Federation for Animals is unable to join us today because of a last-minute impediment. And without making you waiting more, I will now be pleased to introduce Peter Stevenson, who is Chief Policy Advisor at Compassion in World Farming and a qualified UK lawyer. His presentation is about livestock lengthening shadow, fueling runaway environmental harms. Dear Peter, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Sabine. Published in 2006, Livestock's Long Shadow revealed the multiple environmental harms arising from animal farming. It concluded livestock's impact on the environment is already huge and it is growing. Our new report examines what progress has been made over these last 20 years in addressing these problems. And to do this, we've looked both at the harmful impacts of intensive animal farms themselves and at the problems that arise from the production of feed for the animals. And our report shows that livestock's shadow has indeed lengthened. This is perhaps not surprising, as the number of mammals and poultry now being farmed worldwide every year has increased by 33 billion since 2006. Next slide, please. There are warnings from many scientists stressing that we cannot meet the Paris climate targets without a major reduction in the global production of meat and milk. Despite this, production of these foods has continued to soar, with the result that greenhouse gas emissions from animal farming these are the annual emissions, have risen by 22% during the course of this century. The huge increase in the number of animals being farmed has led to two destructive developments: expansion and intensification. And these are key drivers of biodiversity loss and land use change. Next slide. There's growing demand for land, firstly as pasture for cattle, but also to grow soy and cereals, such as wheat and maize, to feed the rising number of industrially farmed animals. And this leads to expansion of farmland into forests and savannas, with massive loss of wildlife habitats and other species-rich ecosystems. But then there's also intensification. This huge demand for feed by industrial livestock production has fueled the intensification of crop production. And this, with its monocultures and synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides has led to soil degradation, overuse and pollution of water, and biodiversity loss, such as steep declines in pollinators and soil biodiversity. In short, industrial animal agriculture is undermining the key resources on which our future ability to feed ourselves depends. Next slide, please. If we combine pastures used for grazing and arable land used to grow feed crops, animals account for 80% of global farmland, but they only produce 18% of the world's calories and 37% of total protein. And since livestock's long shadow, the amount of global arable land being used to produce animal feed has risen from 4.7 million to 6 million square kilometers, an increase of 27%. Next slide, please. Huge amounts of water are withdrawn from rivers, lakes, and groundwater to sustain animal farming. Very little of this is for the animals to drink or clean their housing. Over 90% is used to irrigate animal feed crops. And since livestock's long shadow, the amount of global arable land, the amount of global water being used each year has risen from 112 to 257 cubic kilometers, an increase of 129%. Nitrogen use has gone further into the planetary high-risk zone than any of the other 9 environmental factors covered by the planetary boundaries framework. Indeed, the global animal farming sector emits so much nitrogen that it has single-handedly exceeded the planetary boundary for nitrogen fixation. Next slide. Industrial animal farming has a double burden of nitrogen losses. First, the synthetic fertilizers used to grow animal feed crops have high levels of nitrogen. But crops only absorb about 35% of the nitrogen in these fertilizers. This means that 65% is lost to water or the atmosphere. But then secondly, the concentrate feed given to industrially farmed animals also contains high levels of nitrogen. But pigs and poultry assimilate less than 50% of the nitrogen in their feed. Most of it's just excreted in their manure. So what happens to all this unabsorbed nitrogen? Next slide. Much of it leaches down into groundwater, potentially contaminating sources of drinking water. And a great deal of it runs off to pollute rivers, lakes, wetlands, and coastal waters, forming algal blooms and dead zones. And everything I've said about nitrogen fertilizers applies also to phosphorus fertilizers. So this is a brief summary of what our report shows regarding the increasing environmental damage. So to conclude, livestock shadow has greatly lengthened over these last 20 years, driving immense environmental harm. We need to move to forms of farming that minimize environmental impacts, or indeed, even better, that can benefit the natural world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Peter, for your presentation. Really reminded us that 20 years after the Livestock Long Shadow report, its warning has become always more urgent. Industrial livestock production continued to drive greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, land use change, water depletion, nitrogen pollution, and highlighting the urgent need for systemic transformation. Actually, you can maybe share Peter's report that he presented on livestock lengthening shadow in the chats that you can find on the S3F websites. Now, time to present our next speaker today, explaining what systemic changes are needed. So our next speaker is Merel van der Mark, Head of Animal Welfare and Finance at Sinergia Animal and steering committee member of Stop Financing Factory Farming. Her presentation is titled Key Steps Needed to Reduce Livestock Lengthening Shadow. Dear Merel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. So, as said, I'll be presenting some of the key steps and recommendations from the report. Next slide. One of the most important steps to reduce livestock's lengthening shadow is to decrease the production and consumption of animal source foods, especially in high-income countries. Although technological improvements and more efficient farming practices can help, evidence shows that these measures alone will not be enough to address the climate, biodiversity, and social impacts caused by livestock production. Animal agriculture uses large amounts of land for grazing and feed production, as Steven just showed us. Reducing the consumption of animal-sourced foods would free up significant areas of land for nature restoration and carbon storage. A report by UNEP suggests that high-income countries should reduce consumption by about 68% by 2050, compared with 2020 levels. Research from the Food Systems Economic Commission also emphasizes that shifting towards more plant-based diets is necessary to address the interconnected climate, environmental, and health crisis. Similarly, the World Bank highlights that high-income countries should reduce demand for emission-intensive animal products. Together, these findings, these very important reports, show that creating a more sustainable food system requires not only technological innovation, but also changes in our diets and consumption patterns. Next slide, please. Another key step is introducing true cost accounting into food systems. At present, the price of many livestock products does not reflect their full social and environmental impacts. Costs such as greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, biodiversity loss, and health impacts are often borne by society rather than included in the price consumers pay. True cost accounting aims to make these hidden costs visible and incorporate them into economic decision-making. One way to do this is through taxation, which can help internalize environmental costs and ensure prices better reflect the real impacts of production. The Food Systems Economics Commission estimates that the unaccounted environmental costs of current food systems amount to around $3 trillion every year. The World Bank argues that full cost pricing of animal-sourced foods would make lower emissions alternatives more competitive and encourage more sustainable consumption. And as Olivier de Schutter stated, any society where a healthy diet is more expensive than an unhealthy diet must mend its price system. True cost accounting can help move us towards a food system where prices better align with environmental sustainability and public health. Next, please. A third important step is reforming agricultural subsidies. Globally, agricultural subsidies exceed $635 billion every year. While these policies are often intended to support food production, many subsidies currently encourage environmental harmful practices. According to the World Bank, subsidies often incentivize excessive fertilizer use, contribute to the loss of around 2.2 million hectares of forest annually, and are linked to the spread of vector-borne diseases, including an estimated 3.8 million additional malaria cases each year. As a result, the FAO, UNEP, and UNDP argue that current agricultural subsidies are actively steering the world away from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets of the Paris Agreement. Repurposing these subsidies towards sustainable farming methods, ecosystem protection, and the production of healthier foods will help reduce environmental damage while creating a more resilient and sustainable food system. Next, please. The fourth step is to ensure that food production operates within the Earth's planetary boundaries. Two influential frameworks, the one from the Planetary Boundaries Framework and the Eat Lancet Commission, provide guidance on how food systems can meet human needs while staying within environmental limits. According to Eat Lancet, food production is the single largest driver of planetary boundary transgressions and contributes to 5 of the 6 boundaries that have already been exceeded. This highlights the need to fundamentally rethink how food is produced. More sustainable approaches, such as high welfare, agroecology, agroforestry, and silvopastoral systems, are increasingly recognized for their ability to support biodiversity, improve soil health, reduce environmental impacts, and enhance resilience. Importantly, many of the key characteristics of these systems are also recognized as sustainable within the common nature finance taxonomy, which was developed by multilateral development banks. Thus, this growing consensus suggests that the future of food systems should be designed to work with nature rather than against it. Next, please. And last but not least, we must place animal welfare at the heart of food system transformation. While environmental impacts often dominate the discussion about livestock production, animal welfare receives far less attention. For example, Livestock's Long Shadow, one of the most influential reports on livestock and the environment, makes only a few references to animal welfare. A truly sustainable system should recognize animals as sentient beings whose needs, experiences, and well-being matter. Good animal welfare goes beyond preventing suffering. It means providing animals with opportunities to express natural behavior and enjoy positive experiences, such as exploring the outdoors, nesting, playing, and being raised by their own moms. As Peter Roberts, the founder of Compassion in World Farming, argued, factory farming begins when we stop seeing animals as individuals. The animals used in food production are living creatures, not machines. Any vision for a sustainable food system should respect both environmental limits and the welfare of animals within it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Merel. Your presentation clearly outlined the 5 key steps that we need to reduce the livestock lengthening shadow, from reducing animal source food production and consumption, introducing the true cost accounting and repurposing harmful subsidies, to operating within planetary boundaries, and placing animal welfare, of course, at the center of this needed food systems transformation. The subjects are increasingly shaping international policy discussions, and that now leads to our next speaker's presentation today. I'm now very pleased to introduce you to Lasse Bruun, Director of Climate and Food at the United Nations Foundation and Senior Advisor at the FAO. His presentation is about geopolitics, climate, and protein diversification. Dear Lasse, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sabine, and thank you so much for having me here today. And it's great to follow these two excellent presentations, and also great to see both new people and old friends on the call today. So next slide, please. So I'm just briefly going to talk about the global food system, just to contextualize issues, and I'm going to talk about land use, climate change, and livestock. I'm going to address some of the political and economic risks, and then finally I'm going to talk about a new approach to protein diversification. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I think it makes sense, since we're talking about livestock, just to put it into context of what we are dealing with in the wider food system. And it will come as no surprise to you that I believe we have a broken and fragile food system that in many ways are a continuation of food colonialism. The food system we're seeing today is the echo of what was created more than 100 years ago. So in many ways, in terms of efficiency, we have moved forward, but when it comes to actually the way we do things and how to address aspects of working with nature and equity, we're not doing so well. Food sovereignty, the rights to grow your own food for yourself as farmers and people, and resilience, long-term resilience, are not being prioritized. And as I just mentioned, we're still operating under the paradigm of the last century that we're trying to fight nature, as opposed to working with nature, for instance, using agroecology. Also, nutrition security is increasingly threatened around the world. We have seen a decline in multilateral collaboration over the last couple of years, quite steeply. We have ongoing conflicts and geopolitical instability. You will see that picture here is the Strait of Hormuz, and you all know how that has affected the global trade market. We also have an escalating climate crisis that makes it more difficult to grow food, and we have to relocate and redefine how we grow food. And of course, as was mentioned by Peter as well, we have massive issues with biodiversity loss, which is sad within itself, but also affects the way we grow food. And we also have a new geopolitical reality, which could be positive if it works out well, which is that the BRICS plus countries, and you can see the flags here of the countries that are part of that, are increasingly taking more realm of the global food system. In the past, we used to focus a lot on the collaboration between the Common Agriculture Policy and the US Farm Bill. Now there's increasing focus on the export and commodity market coming from Latin America, particularly to China and elsewhere. And China has also recently stated that they want to shift from being a net importer of food to being a net exporter of food. So things are going to happen. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've already touched a lot on the land use issues, but I always like to bring up this picture because it's just daunting to me. And for all I know, it's actually worse now. If you look at the top brown field, that is all the land that's available in the world on this planet. And within that, 76% is habitable. That means we can live on it. Like, it's not glaciers or barren land. It's actually places we can be on. Within that, 45%, that green field, is used for agriculture. So out of the whole planet, you can see now we're down to 45% being used for agriculture out of the habitable land we have. Within that piece of 45% of habitable land, 80%, the vast majority, is used for livestock, which is for meat, dairy, textiles, and so forth. But here's an interesting thing. If you look at the penultimate bar there, you see even though it takes up 80% of the land use, it only delivers 17% of the calories, while 16% of the land is used for crops for food, and it delivers 83% of the food we need. So you can see there's something wrong with this calculation, irrespective of where you find yourself on the spectrum on climate change, animal welfare, just from a purely efficiency and good use of resources, return on investment, if you will, this is not good. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to bring your talk briefly about the political and international security issues. There was a recent report by Trace Intelligence for Sustainable Trade came out with this new report where they looked at the Beijing-Brasilia effect, a new paradigm for sustainable commodity trade, which I alluded to before. And they find, looking in the crystal ball, if you will, they find that insecure food systems will exacerbate conflicts and economic stability. So all these aspects we've been mentioning so far, they will be exacerbated, and we will have conflicts that is not just impacting the way we grow food and have food, but also impacting peace writ large. And institutions such as NATO, the International Monetary Foundation, and the World Bank acknowledges these systemic risks as well. So it's quite serious. And they find in this report there's 3 ways to address this and mobilize political action. One is to really focus on resilience, that food systems should be seen as being essential to socioeconomic robustness and guarding against climate shocks. Which means that when you do a security briefing for a country, when you talk about what can we do to make sure we're safe and we're self-resilient, it's not just focusing on issues of defense or border control. It is really focusing on food production. And we all know which way that should be going. Security is another aspect. Food insecurity can catalyze conflicts and has to be integrated into national security planning. So even like looking more long-term, food has to be central to that. And also growth, which they found that if you invest in the right agri-food systems, which means that more plant-rich, more external, more agroecology-based, you can actually create growth, jobs, and more general stability in the countries. Next slide, please. So another report I just wanted to mention to you here because I found this really, really interesting. So the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, that's the official institution that advises the EU writ large. So the Council, the Parliament, and everybody else in any single institution that is within the EU has this board, this institution as a key advisor. And they came out with a report very recently. It's called Strengthening Resilience to Climate Change. And they had some really interesting takeaways when it comes to livestock. They found that unless you have a fundamental reform of the EU livestock system, you cannot have long-term economic viability and resilience for European farming. So unless we change status quo, we're slowly going to see a decline and ultimately a phase out of agriculture as we know it today in the EU, both because of climate change issues, but also because of other aspects like loss of competitiveness and so forth. It's also very clear that EU has climate objectives that has been set, very strict objectives. And the report also finds that unless the livestock sector is really addressed, they're not going to be able to meet them. It also emphasizes that technological solutions as feed additives will not be sufficient to address the sector's challenges. So you will see there's been a lot of focus on feeding additives to cows to decrease methane production. You've seen how that's gone horribly wrong from an efficiency perspective, also from an animal welfare perspective. But it also finds that even those little patches, little band-aids are not going to serve to fix the bigger issues. There has to be a systemic change. And finally, it also says that if we want to really have a long-term resilient future for livestock systems, there need to be a really systemic way of addressing it. The incremental changes we keep seeing, that feed additives or changing the way that we are keeping the animals or making small shifts that might add to some small percentage changes is not going to work. We have to have a systemic change, which means a significant decrease in livestock production across the EU. Next slide, please. So this is about a new approach to protein diversification. Some of the work we've been doing at the United Nations Foundation is trying to find ways of increasing collaboration between countries on this, particularly when it comes to countries that are very different. And the more we've been looking into it, we have found that some of the common denominators for finding this collaboration is focused around equity, global differentiation, food diversity, and health. So when it comes to equity, when we have to focus on how to feed the world, also with livestock, equity is essential. It is inherently inequitable that across, for instance, Africa, people have an average in consumption of between 8 and 15 kilos of meat per capita per year, whereas in the US, it's around 120 kilos per capita per year. That is inherently inequitable, and that is something that really has to change. And our approach is to see how we can find ways of having an equitable distribution of food, including livestock. We also really need to focus on the common but differentiated responsibility principle, which essentially means that those who are having the biggest responsibility for pollution, or in this case, livestock production, are the ones who have to move the most and the fastest. Essentially, it's the polluter pays principle just applied to climate more at large, and particularly in this case on livestock. And also we have to focus on nutrition insecurity is addressed at the low and middle income countries. We cannot have a conversation talking about less in countries that are inherently written by nutrition insecurity, stunting, hunger. They don't want to hear about less, and understandably so. So we need to talk about nutrition security in the same way. And also about food diversity. We need to make sure that it is not just about novel and alternative protein. We need to also look at what is already available and what is more culturally and historically the food that is being eaten across the different continents and countries. And finally, the health aspect. There's something to be said about trying to see what has happened in other parts of the world when we look at low and middle income countries. We have seen in some countries there's been a shift going from nutrition insecurity and hunger straight into having type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases based on the wrong food. That, of course, is not desirable for those countries, and we're in deep dialogue with them trying to see how that can be addressed. Next slide, please. And finally here, I just want to say that we have had some headway bringing different countries together. Countries as different as Denmark and Ghana and Gambia and Brazil, as you can see the flags here, but also countries like Finland, Thailand as well, and have had initial conversations with China as well. And essentially the aspect of this is to send a little bit a signal of hope today that when done right, there is an opportunity for very different countries to collaborate around this, and for very different countries to find a common way forward, acknowledging that there are very different theories of change, but there can be a joint theory of transformation. So like most other stakeholders who are engaging in the food and climate space, we're really looking forward to COP32 next year in Ethiopia, which we think is going to be a landmark climate COP, particularly when it comes to food. And we're going to see how we can maximize this opportunity to really set the focus on equitable distribution of food, including protein, so have proper protein diversification across the world to address all the issues we're trying to discuss here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Lasse, for your great presentation. So you could highlight that the future food systems will increasingly be shaped by geopolitics, climate change, and global security considerations, and that protein diversification offers a strategic opportunity to strengthen resilience, food sovereignty, economic stability, and long-term sustainability. Thank you so much for that. So together, today's presentation could show that transforming livestock systems is central to address the interconnected challenges of climate, environment, biodiversity, public health, food security, and of course, animal welfare. So thank you very much again to all the speakers today for your insightful presentation. And now I'm pleased to turn to our panel discussion before addressing the questions from the audience. And I'd really like to begin to reflect on a broad opening question at the start. And this question is, what is at risk if we fail to transform our food systems? And why is action becoming so increasingly urgent? So if I may, I will propose to Merel if you would like to address first these questions, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. If we fail to transform our food systems, we face consequences on several levels. Environmentally, we risk accelerating climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, ecosystem degradation, and undermining the natural systems that food production depends on. With the weakening of natural systems, we risk more failed harvests, disrupted supply chains, rising food prices, and increased hunger, which in turn will put pressure on public finance and cause economic and financial instability. There's also an ethical risk. Industrial livestock systems treat animals as units of production rather than sentient beings. Normalizing the domination and commodification of vulnerable beings can reinforce broader attitudes towards hierarchy and exploitation, which can make societies more accepting of inequality and other forms of exploitation. In short, transforming the food system is about avoiding escalating environmental, economic, social, and ethical risks, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, very clear. Dear Peter and Lasse, would you like to jump in to address this question as well?
Comments, but Sabine, tell me, I can't remember whether we're later going to have a chance, but if not, perhaps I could touch upon it now. Looking at why is it so hard to get the powers to be, the big international organizations and governments to accept the need for change? And if we could get them to accept it, what would we need to do? Can I make some comments on this now, or do you prefer to leave it till later?
I guess we have time, Peter, so if you want to go ahead, please do so.
I mean, for me, one of the big problems is that I think governments simply don't see, I touched upon it in my presentation, the link between, factory farming of animals and intensive arable production, that this huge demand for feed is driving intensive arable. The two are very kind of closely connected. And the facts are really shocking. In the European Union, the Commission says that almost 2/3 of the cereals we produce are used as animal feed. FIFAC, the industry feed body, says that just 23% of the cereals we grow in the EU are used for direct human consumption. Most of it going to animals, some going to biofuels, things like that. Now, these figures are just not just in the EU. A big report published by West and others 2 months ago gave very similar figures for Brazil and the US. There is something utterly insane about a food system in which some of the well-developed countries are using less than a quarter of their grain to directly feed people. But I had this strong image the other day of an iceberg. I think what policymakers are seeing, they see the bit of the iceberg you see. So they see these huge amounts of chickens and pigs being farmed on a small bit of land, and they think, gosh, this is efficient. What they don't see is the 9/10 of the iceberg below the water. They don't recognize these huge amounts of cereals and soy being used. They don't recognize all the environmental damage coming from that we've looked at in our new report. So part of the problem is that the very bodies that could begin to lead the change, many of them are just not seeing the need for it. And obviously, we're particularly seeing that with the multilateral development banks. I'd like to come back later to what can we do about this, but I'm sure Lasse wants to add to this as well. Thanks.
Absolutely, Peter. I guess you are fully right on that. Dear Lasse, would you have some thoughts about this opening question?
No, it's a good question, and I think Merel and Peter already provided some really good answers. Maybe I just want to add a few practical thoughts, which is that in my presentation, I talked about how we are still working with an old paradigm in terms of how we produce food. And that paradigm is also built on what the world looked like about 100, a little less than 100 years ago. And just a little reminder, around 1920, we were 2 billion people, 2 billion people on this planet. Now we're 8.2. We more than quadrupled in less than 100 years. So it's while things might have been possible to do things like grow food in a quote unquote bad way in the 1920s, we are simply running out of space and we have to change things. So again, irrespective of where you find yourself on the spectrum, even if you don't care about animal welfare or climate change, is if you want to feed people, things have to change. We cannot keep using all these amazing cereals and crops and run them through animals and get very little out. It's just not good economy. And any economist or industrialists who are interested in efficiency, they will see this and say, yeah, that does not make any sense. So in terms of the long-term resilience and trying to see what is going to happen if we don't change things, well, if we don't change things, we will have a collapse. There won't be enough to feed people. And people like myself who are privileged living in the global north, I might be fine for the next 20 years, 30 years. But the ones who are really going to bear the brunt of this change is going to be people in low and middle income countries that are going to see increased hunger. And then that exacerbated with the climate change is not going to be a pretty picture. We'll all remember I guess my generation and older will remember, like in the 1980s, the hunger across the Horn of Africa, how horrible that was to see. That is going to be nothing compared to what we're going to see unless we change things. We simply cannot go on without changing the way we produce food, and that means significantly decreasing livestock production.
Thank you for raising it so clearly, dear Lasse. So yes, absolutely, this nonsense of continuing to grow animal suffering and environmental harms, climate change, and all these global harms that the livestock production is producing. And just to mention, for animal protectionists here today, when we mention livestock, it's because it's like the policy official word to talk about farming of animals. The farming of land animals. But of course, we are not like in favor of livestock as a wording, because we also consider animals as sentient beings, of course, as Merel clearly raised. So when we talk about livestock, it's because of the name of this report that Peter mentioned earlier, and also because that's the freaking policy name of it. So yeah, thank you very much again, Lasse, for raising this nonsense and this urgent need to change and deeply shift from animal protein food system to maybe more plant-based, or at least animal alternatives for not only animals but also people and the planet. Now, as we are really into development finance with the Stop Financing Factory Farming Coalition, I would like to address a second question to all of you. So how can multilateral development banks, commercial banks, and other financial actors can accelerate the transition towards more sustainable and ethical food systems? So if I may, I would like to invite you, Peter, to first begin answering these questions, please. This question.
Right. At the moment, what we've got with the multilateral development banks is a huge funding of factory farming. The reason they like this is partly they get good returns, risks are low. They're familiar with it. It's easy. It's much more challenging to then switch to funding agroecology. But there are already some good examples of financial institutions doing this upon which the others could draw. So the French Development Finance Agency, Agence Française de Développement, actually has a strategic commitment to agroecology. Similarly, the UN body, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, is committed to agroecology. Its report says that in the years 2018 to 2023, 60% of its funding went to agroecology. Then there's something called the Global Agriculture and Food Security Programme, which also works in this area and is actually administered by the World Bank Group. And between them, these and other bodies have developed mechanisms for helping farmers, move to agroecology, for example, through training and technical advice, but also through concessional lines of credit, preferable, also preferable low interest loans. And at the best, it's not just low interest, but it's a delayed start for several years of having to repay the loan. Because if a farmer is moving to agroecology, this is quite a challenge. They're going to need time to get to the point where they're making enough income to start repaying the loan. So there are examples to draw on. As regards commercial banks, the leader here is Triodos, and again, other banks could learn from them about how to go about supporting agroecology. It's challenging because clearly big institutions can't work with each individual small-scale farmer. They need to work with producer organizations, farmer cooperatives, to then they will then pass money down to the actual individual farmers. I want to just talk for a moment also about animal welfare. To Compassionate World Farming, World Animal Protection, and Humane World for Animals set up a few years ago the Farms Initiative. And this was specifically for banks. They were saying to us, yes, we know we need to think about animal welfare, but we need some standards. So FARMS stands for Farm Animal Responsible Minimum Standards. We've drafted these, we've created these for all the main farm species. They're available on the farm's website in English, Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Thai, Vietnamese, Malaysian and Indonesian. So we've really tried to take a kind of a world approach to this. And these standards are based on the International Finance Corporation's Good Practice Note on Animal Welfare, which is very helpful. It sets out key welfare risks and mitigation strategies for addressing them. Sadly, the IFC itself routinely ignores its own good practice note on animal welfare, but we have taken its principles as the kind of foundation for the Farms Initiative. So again, banks who are interested in supporting good welfare, there's all this material available to guide them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, dear Peter. It was, pretty complete answer. But I would like to invite maybe Merel or Lasse to jump in if you have, maybe Merel, about, the role, the key role of development finance institution to complete what Peter just said.
Sure, I think Peter gave a pretty comprehensive answer, but I think it's really important that development banks start really looking at their mandate, which is to align their finance with the goals of the biodiversity framework, with the Paris Agreement, with the SDGs. And they're not doing this. They're preferring profit over actually investing in sustainable development. And their own reports that we've mentioned, several of them here, show the risk of inaction, right? As Lasse was saying, like, the risk of not acting is huge, and that will mean huge financial losses and economic instability. So, banks really need to kind of do some more risk assessment, read their own reports, and start implementing their own recommendations.
Yeah, totally right. Thank you so much, Merel. Would you like to add anything, dear Lasse?
Well, maybe just in addition to how the development banks invest and use their own funds, they can also be supportive of other initiatives. And one thing comes to mind last year at the Climate Summit in Brazil, COP30, Brazil, together with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, launched something called the RAIZ project. And I'll just say it slowly for the translators. It stands for resilient agriculture investment for net zero land degradation. So essentially, it looks into mobilizing resources and technologies to restore degraded land. And as we know, most of that degraded land is for either growing feed for animals or for having animals grazing, particularly in Brazil. So there's an opportunity as well as there's an effort to rewild these degraded lands, to also focus on, first of all, what caused it in the first place. It was not just agriculture writ large, it is specifically livestock. Secondly, how do we move to a system that allows it, or disallows it rather, not to happen again, which means really focusing on less livestock production and more food growth and production for people directly. And maybe one more thing to mention is that I always found it interesting when it comes to risk assessments to look at insurance companies, because insurance companies, they don't muck about. They look at what is the essential risk for us. And I'm not talking about like a little house insurance, like where I live myself. I'm talking about the big insurance companies that insure like conglomerate companies or even like government's insurance and so forth. Those insurance companies, they will look at what are the main risks and how do we mitigate those risks. And I've always found it interesting to see if you get into conversations, at least behind closed doors, with some insurance companies, they will tell you, well, they definitely see that livestock production is a massive risk. And I think it's just interesting to see how we can keep learning from that and maybe nudge the development banks to that end as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lasse. Yeah, indeed. And beyond the banks, we know that the governments are also providing some subsidies to livestock production directly or indirectly. I mean, in Europe right now, we are discussing the next common agricultural policy, allocating billions and billions to the European agriculture. And we know that more than 80% of these subsidies are going to livestock production directly or indirectly through feed-dependent systems. And of course, only a very tiny bit of these subsidies is going to plant-based production for human consumption. So here there's also a major gap, which is not like complying with policy commitments or legal obligations for going to more sustainable and ethical food systems. So of course, this bank investment and government choices are having a huge impact in shaping the present and future of our food systems. And now, Lasse, to continue with you on the last question, because I would like to invite you to answer first to this question, because it's directly connected to your presentation. So according to you and other panelists after you, what geopolitical trends are likely to shape the future of food systems, and what opportunities do they create to improve the current system, according to you, dear Lasse?
Thank you so much, Sabine. Well, I alluded to it already in my presentation, which is about the new way of you see the commodity market and current trends are shifting quite significantly. As I mentioned, you know, when one used to do agriculture commodity analysis, you know, some of the two key stakeholders would be looking at would be the US and the EU, looking at, as you mentioned, Sabine, the Common Agriculture Policy and the US Farm Bill in covering the US production. So that, of course, has changed somewhat, both because of some of the multilateral constraints we see with the current administration in the US, like not being in favor of multilateralism, but also because things are changing in terms of power dynamics. Let me give an example. You all know how things have changed in China with regards to renewable energy. You know, electric cars, batteries for electric cars, and solar power has, by and large, really been boosted so much by China. that now the prices for those vehicles, for those batteries, and for solar panels have gone down. Solar panels, solar power is now the cheapest power in terms of immediate and local production of energy. And that is down to numbers, the quantity that we're seeing in China. And when you look at China's next 5-year plan, so every 5 years, China comes out with a 5-year plan that says, this is what we're going to do as a country. And this time, the plan that just recently came out essentially says that China wants to be self-sufficient and even a net exporter of food by 2030, and maybe 2035, depending. But there's some uncertainty around that. But at least that is a very strong aspiration. Right now, China is massively importing food, and as somebody mentioned in the chat, I saw that. A lot of that import is soy for the pig production in the country. The vast majority of soy produced in Brazil is going to China for animal feed. It used to be there's a lot coming from US as well, but that's slowly declining. So if China wants to be self-sufficient, including in animal feed, and hopefully also shifting to less animal production, that is going to change things a lot, because if 80% of Brazil's soy production all of a sudden does not have anywhere to be shipped. And also we're seeing the trend in the EU where they're going to be focusing on less livestock production, so less import of feed to that as well. What is Brazil going to do? Soy is one of the key commodities, key export commodities of that country. So they will need to do something different. And that's just one of the disruptions we're going to see as China and the BRICS countries together are going to shift focus and take up more power. You might know that there's been conversations about developing a new currency. The BRICS countries would be behind that. It's taken a long time. We're not there yet. But in theory, they could be developing a new currency that could replace the dollar as the global dominant currency. And that would lead to also very significant changes in the stock market that again trickles down to food production and then down to livestock production. So as we're seeing these massive disruptions in the power dynamics right now, we need to ask ourselves, which way could this be going? How can we help push it in the right direction? And what is it exactly we're going to see? And as you know, it's always much easier to change, to drive something in a certain direction before it has gone there and anchored itself than trying to fix it later on. So I think we have a window of 4, 5, 6 years now where we as a community and governments that are aligned with what this movement wants to do can really see how we can push things in the right direction. Because if done correctly, this could be a new way of seeing food production globally. If it is not done correctly, we're going to go into another lockdown phase, and then I'm going to find myself looking much more gray in 20 years from now, having the same conversation, talking about how now we are seeing a food system that is regressive, but now it's dominated by China, and that's not something anybody should be aspiring to. So I think we should ask ourselves some really important questions and do a lot of analysis together as to where we're heading as a food system and how we can push things in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for raising again these broken food systems and geopolitics and trades and everything. It's clear that we need to change these things, and the window you're giving of these few years really raised the state of the urgency to take actions, and for big investors as development banks to make the right choice and shift direction of their massive investments worldwide. So, dear Peter, would you like to add anything on these geopolitical trends?
Yes, and I'd particularly like, and again, forgive me, it's not. I'd like to come back to what I was talking before about what are the things that are kind of preventing change, and I'd like to look at that and also what the change could be. I think one big problem is that the industrial animal agriculture has propagated a number of myths that policymakers tend to believe. So they claim that it's necessary, that we can't feed the growing world population without it. But so many, again, one comes back to this wasteful use of soy and grain to feed animals. Compassionate World Farming produced a report 2 years ago where I calculated that if we stopped feeding human edible grain to animals, we could feed an extra 2 billion people worldwide every year. And that was an immensely cautious calculation because other studies suggest it's 3.5 to 4 billion. So this is not necessary to feed the world. They claim that it's efficient, but again, it's because of its use for cereals, it's staggeringly inefficient. They claim it's cheap. Yes, it may be cheap at the supermarket checkout, but when you compute the huge damage done to the environment and human health, it is actually. I remember there was it's very expensive. There was an editorial a couple of years ago in the journal, the very respected journal Nature, pointing this out, saying that all these damaging costs generated by industrial farming, it's left to taxpayers and governments to pick up these costs. The World Bank has even referred to these as implicit subsidies, the fact that they're allowed to cause all this nitrogen pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, without having to pay for it. They said these implicit subsidies are even greater than the explicit subsidies. And we need to think about, and I think I saw something in the chat about this, who ultimately is benefiting from factory farming? It's not individual farmers. It's obviously the big, huge, producers and processors, people like JBS. Less obviously, it's the big input providers. So I'm thinking of the handful of companies that produce the genetics, the fast-growing, high-yielding pigs and chickens throughout the world, the manufacturers of the cages and crates. Then when you look at the feed supply, it's all the companies that provide synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. It's the handful of huge grain traders like Cargill. Above all, probably, it's the manufacturers of this concentrate feed, a sector worth about $400 billion a year. All these input providers, their business model is dependent on factory farming. If we change to agroecology and other things like that, farmers wouldn't suffer, their produce is still needed. But these big input providers would see demand for their produce kind of plummet. So we need to kind of really get that across to policymakers. But just wanting to touch upon, okay, what would have to be done to make a change? And there's a really interesting study done by the EU's platform on sustainable finance, saying that apart from good pasture systems, the only form of animal farming that is sustainable is integrated crop livestock production. And they produced very specific figures of what this might look like. They said that 80% of the nutrients for the farm, to grow the crops, should be coming from on the farm, from animal manure and from legumes. They said no more than 10% of the feed should be brought in soy and cereals. So there's a lot of good reports and studies for governments and other policymakers to draw upon if they finally galvanize themselves into recognizing the need for far-reaching change. Thank you, Sabine.
Thank you so much, Peter, for raising that. The subsidies are really artificially reducing the costs of animal products in the market. Rather, it's 1,000 times more costly to produce animal products rather than plant proteins, for instance, which is only a few cents. And in the market, in the end, it's barely sometimes the same for 1 kilo or 100 grams of good tofu or 100 grams of animal products, which is a total nonsense again, because of all the internal and external costs to produce these animal products, again, artificially reduced by this subsidy and investment operations. So, dear Merel, would you like to add anything about it, please?
Yeah, maybe just you mentioned opportunities, and one thing that came to my mind is the Stop Financing Factory Farming Coalition maps the projects that big development banks are being proposed to finance and that they're financing. And in recent years, we've seen a lot of increase in projects going to industrial livestock in Africa. And of course, IFC especially arguments that this is important because it needs to support feeding the world. But at the same time, we're seeing also a lot of opposition against this model. Like just earlier this week, there was a really, really good webinar about a report from IATP and AFSA about showing how this industrial livestock model does a lot of harm. It causes environmental impacts, but also a lot of social impacts. It outcompetes the small-scale farmers. So there's a lot of resistance. And I think because this is maybe not yet as prevalent as it is in Europe, for example, it could be really a good opportunity for the IFC and other big development banks to take stock, to really do proper consultation with people on the ground, like what is the kind of food system that you want and what is actually the best way to produce food, and start financing that instead of insisting in this road to more industrial livestock.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this very clear and interesting additional information, dear Merel. And now I see that we have still 20 minutes left together. So I will open to 15 minutes questions and answers from the audience. I've been selecting a few of them, and I'm so sorry. I'm not sure we will have time to address them all. Thank you so much for your strong engagement and for your questions that are really, really interesting. So I'd like to start with the first question. I guess it's directed to Peter. How does the report distinguish between factory farming and extensive pastoral systems? The critique of feed-dependent industrial livestock is essential, but in many Mediterranean and mountain areas, the loss of grazing also causes abandonment, landscape closure, biodiversity loss, higher fire risk, and broken nutrient cycles. Pastoralism can maintain open habitats, use crop residues, move fertility, and support territorial circularity. So, Peter, may I kindly ask you your thoughts about this question?
Yes, the report is mainly looking at the environmental impacts of factory farming and the production of feed for it, but it does also look at pastoral systems. And I think, yes, pastoral systems can be environmentally good and they can have very high welfare standards. But equally, there's many parts in the world, and I'm particularly thinking of Brazil, where, pasture for cattle has been the main driver, even more than the growing of soy. It's the main driver of deforestation in the Amazon and the loss of really important ecosystems like the Cerrado. So we've got to be careful. Pasture isn't always a good thing. Indeed, one of my items in a recipe for governments wanting to make change would be, and I know this sounds radical, we need to restore all the pasture created in the last, 30, 40 years by deforestation and expansion into other important ecosystems. That needs to be returned to those forests and ecosystems. But traditional pasture, like the kind referred to by the questioner, yes, as long as that's done well, so that it's not leading to degradation of land through overgrazing, that kind of pasture can be very positive. You really need to emphasize, that the report is not against all animal agriculture. We recognize that particularly in agroecology and integrated crop livestock systems, good pasture systems, there is a positive role for animals to play. Thanks, Sabine.
Thank you, Peter. As we have quite a lot of questions to address today, I will now move to the second question addressed to all panelists from Taylor Quinn. Thank you, Taylor, for your question. So global food system and food security organizations are looking to find evidence-based solutions that address malnutrition, create jobs, affordability, etc. What are the specific solutions that you, dear speakers, see as fundable today? And as an extra question, the World Bank has an alternative protein investment portfolio today, but it is fully insect farm investments, as the insect farm lobby has done a great job in getting fundable solutions in front of key funders. So is anyone doing this for animal welfare and plant-based food to, of course, replace this intensive livestock production? So first is an evidence-based solution to address malnutrition, create job affordability, etc. Do you see any specific solution that are fundable today with regards to our objectives? Peter, would you like to go first?
Okay. So there's lots. Yes, of course, we recognize that there's some of the poorest parts of the world, there are serious problems of malnutrition. I would recognize, I'm not sure if all my colleagues would agree with me, that some of the poorest people in the world might benefit from an increased consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs. But we've got to do that in a way that does not destroy the livelihoods of small-scale farmers. And this big push to bring it, industrial farming into Africa is a real worry, because apart from the environmental harms, it's going to undermine traditional small-scale farmers. And this is not just me as an outsider talking. I know there's one coalition of African bodies is shortly planning an event at a big conference where they're really making the argument for traditional indigenous poultry breeds to survive rather than being ousted by the industrial breeds. So I think we need to find forms of farming, of which, a shorthand for that is agroecology, that can allow better nutrition, but still can be environmentally friendly and supportive of local farmers. And again, I really want to recommend anybody who wants an example of something really good, go to the website of Sustainable Agriculture Tanzania, who've helped their farmers move to agroecology and organic. They've found that by doing that, they need fewer inputs of chemical inputs, so it saves a lot of money. They're building soil quality through agriculture. They're getting better yields, improved livelihoods and incomes for farmers. There's a marvelous study also, I can't remember its full title, again, drawing on many African examples, looking at the bringing together of agriculture, livestock and forestry, with, again, similar results of improved yields. So we don't need factory farming in the global south. And indeed, factory farming can be very, very disruptive and destructive of livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Now I'm turning over to Merel, because I know that Sinergia Animal is also doing a big job with the World Bank and multilateral development banks. So what do you think of this insects farming solution that is apparently like attracting more investments from these big banks? And do you feel like we can have like this kind of specific solution plans for really shifting away from livestock farming, maybe toward more plant-based food or alternative products? Curious of your thoughts, dear Merel.
Thanks, Sabine. So yes, indeed, we've seen the World Bank, but also other development banks finance insect projects, with probably the idea that this could be an alternative. But we've also seen that a number of insect companies have actually gone bankrupt. They've not been successful. Projects that the IFC and the EIB have financed have not been successful. And it's not even because of the animal welfare, because that's something these companies the banks and other companies really care much about, unfortunately. But the whole business model and idea that this would be more efficient is just not the fact. there's, I think, this common misconception that insects can just eat waste. But if you feed them waste, they can get sick very easily, and they can pass on pathogens. So that is not actually possible. You have to give them proper food. And by giving them proper food, for example, derived from soy, you're just adding an additional step. So instead of feeding soy directly to people or soy to chickens, you're feeding it to insects to then feed them to chickens and to then feed them to humans. So it only adds an additional inefficiency step where you lose energy, where you lose calories and proteins and so on. So I think the model in itself is just not feasible. It's not efficient, it's not feasible. And I suspect that these models will not remain around because it's just not an efficient way to produce food.
Yes, thank you. So you raised it clearly. So why not proposing these investment banks to invest in producing good soy and legumes and plant-rich proteins products for humans consumption? Seems pretty obvious. What do you think about it?
Absolutely, it is. It seems pretty obvious. And again, like the agroecological model is very good for biodiversity because it combines different plants and it reduces the need for pesticides, for fertilizer, and so on. And it also produces a variety of foods, you know, producing much more nutritious foods, increasing the self-sufficiency of farmers and of the communities around them. So that would definitely be a much better way to go.
And what about their interests in going this way? Do you see all the potential to solve all the big challenges that we're facing right now?
I think the MDBs could really play a leading role in paving the way. Right now, they try to be these leaders in mobilizing private finance and just investing in the business as usual. They need to be bold, but they could really make this shift in thinking about how to produce sustainable food and develop models that are not as profitable for sure in monetary terms, but that will have many like social, environmental, and climate benefits that will benefit us all and that will reduce costs in other budget items, right? So yeah, we call on the development banks to really lead and develop ways to finance sustainable food systems, not prioritizing profit, but prioritizing planetary boundaries and people and health and nutrition.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if it's not like profits, they would make huge economies, right? In affording with more efficient food systems rather than inefficient and harmful one as factory farming or massive livestock production, as you said, business as usual. So now I'm turning to the next question. I guess it's more directed to you, dear Lasse. So how can climate finance stop supporting industrial livestock expansion? But also, I would like also maybe to go more to a specific question directed to you, dear Lasse, because I see that time is going fast. Someone already asked for you to tell us a bit more about the UN Foundation and how this foundation can help, support this food system transformation.
Sure, I can be quite brief there. The UN Foundation was founded in 1997 as an institution to help work with and on behalf of the UN. And essentially our job is to work with the other UN institutions on finding ways to stepping in where there might be need for some help, or there might be opportunities to push things more further. So we work on three different issues. The top line issues is women and girls. We work on public health, and we work on climate and environment. And within climate and environment, one of our key programs is on food and climate, which is the one that I'm leading. So essentially, we predominantly work in the multilateral space, which means we work with institutions such as FAO, World Health Organizations, the IPCC, the UNFCCC, but also directly with governments trying to find ways of improving multilateral collaboration and also working directly with governments on site in countries on aspects of, for instance, improving ministerial collaboration and so forth. If I may, just very briefly to the previous question, just to make a little comparison, because I'm a sucker for comparisons, as you might have figured out by now, is that, you know, for the last 20, 15, 10 years, stakeholders around the world has been trying to push something called solar radiation management out there, which is essentially thinking that the planet is heating. So let's put some chemicals in the air that creates a fake cloud cover that reflects a lot of the sun so the planet doesn't heat as quickly as previously expected. And not surprisingly, it has not worked. It is because human nature is we want to have our cake and eat it too. And simply we cannot continue with this way of thinking. And the comparison here is that feed additives and focusing on insect farming is not going to work. It is small attempts to see how can we do everything the way we've done before and not make big sacrifices, such as producing and consuming less meat. It's just not going to work. So we have to really focus on the root issue and move beyond these band-aids and find the real solutions. I just wanted to make that point. And then maybe also since I saw Taylor was asking that question, I think one of the best things you can do is really work on the ground in countries, particularly in low and middle income countries, on working in a way that supplies people with culturally sensitive and culturally traditional foods that can be produced using what is already available. So we might see in 20 years from now cultivated meat being produced all across the world, including in African villages. But until we get there, we need to work with what we have. And there's plenty of great solutions of working on the ground using traditional crops such as teff, cassava, corn, wheat to produce nutritious and sustainable food that is much more nutritious, much cheaper, and much more resilient than putting up a lot of chicken farms, as we often see. Thanks.
Thank you, dear Lasse. So yes, sorry that we cannot address all the questions, but with the questions we had and the answers, we provided some transversal answers already that have been addressed in many questions with regards to pastoralism, the small-scale farmers, the externalities of the costs, and so on. So sorry not to be able to address more specific questions today, as we're reaching the end now of our webinar, and I would like to say a few closing remarks now. So first of all, of course, thank you very much to you all for joining our webinar today, and a sincere thanks to our speakers for sharing their invaluable expertise and insights. I believe that today's discussion has shown that while the challenges we are facing with our food systems have intensified over the past 20 years, so too has the evidence and the opportunity for meaningful change. From development finance to agricultural policies, addressing animal welfare, climate resilience, and protein diversification now, the pathways towards a more sustainable and ethical food system is becoming increasingly clear. So to continue exploring these issues, I warmly encourage you to read the new report, Livestock Lengthening Shadow, available on SFFF website. And you're also warmly invited to join the next S3F webinar on the 10th of July, entitled Who Benefits from Livestock Finance? And finally, I warmly want to thank the Stop Financing Factory Farming Coalition for hosting this webinar today, our interpreters, and all of you for joining, with my special thanks to the core organizing team, with Emily Randall, Arturo Garcia, Wendy Smith, together with our partnering organizations, World Animal Justice, Compassion in World Farming, Sinergia Animal, the World Federation for Animals, and the United Nations Foundation. So thank you very much for your participation and engagement. We hope that today's discussion will inspire you to continue collaboration and concrete actions toward food system transformation that is healthier for people, fairer for animals, and more sustainable for our planet. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias. Goodbye and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.